I thought maybe instead of talking to you at all about the necessary and good science with regard to reclamation and restoration and reclaiming lands and waters, I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about the history of the Superfund site with regard, in the Congress, with regard to Butte. Yeah? Carol and I flew back from Montana in the early 80s, and there were several luggage circles, you know, in the luggage place. We were waiting for our bags, and we looked over there, and about 20 or 30 feet away was the former Senator Mike Mansfield. And Mike and I think I can say, were fairly good friends. And Mike knew Carol's dad, who'd been mayor in Butte, Vern Hannah Griffith. And so we went over, and I don't know how many of you dealt with Mike, but he wouldn't, you know, if he hadn't have been Mike Mansfield, we just thought he was just some rude guy around, because he'd stand like this. He never tucked this arm in here. He'd do this, and he'd stand there. And if people came up to him, he knew them. Most of he knew 80% of them. But he wouldn't act like he knew them until they got right here. So it was very disconcerting trying to deal with the guy. And I walked up to him, and I got right here. I'd been in Congress. Y'all had sent me to Congress about 4 years before. And he put out his hand and said, "Hello, Pat. What are we doing for the Berkeley pit?" That was it. I tried to talk to him about other things, and his bags came, and he said goodbye, and he was gone. What are we going to do about the Berkeley pit? What are you doing about the Berkeley pit? A couple of years later, Mike was ambassador in Japan, and Mike and, forget his name, the premier over there, Nagasaki maybe? Mike brought him to the United States for some summit meetings about trade. Mike was very big on fairly open trade. That was the one thing the unions were always mad at Mike about. He was for open trade. And unions, you know, this is their job to save their jobs. So. But Mike brought the premier of Japan over, and the first stop was the Congress. And there were some senators to meet him and some members of Congress. It was invitation. Just enough people in this fairly small room called the Rayburn Room. And the majority leader at the time, Tom Foley, our neighbor from Idaho over here, from the Spokane congressional area, asked me to stand next to him to greet Mike as he was coming in with the premier. And so Mike pushed the premier ahead, and he introduced him to Tom Foley and introduced him to me, and then the premier went on, and Mike went around Foley. You know, it's just kind of a rude thing to do. Foley was majority leader, and he came up to me and said, "You didn't get back to me about the pit. How's it going?" He was very worried about the pit because he didn't have much to do with it when he was in there. Superfund came after Mike. Came when I got there, but others had been working on it, but it happened to pass a couple of years after I got there. And I was then, and always when it was reauthorized, you know, they reauthorize these laws all the time to bring them up to where they ought to be and make them work better. I was always in the House worried about Superfund in Butte and trying to shape Superfund's contours so that it fit the cleanup that was necessary in Butte. This was one of the 10 biggest, at least then, and I don't think it's changed, 10 biggest Superfund sites, most expensive and longest in America. The leading Superfund site was that one called Love Canal, which was really killing people over on the other coast. But ours was really very important. It's an interesting thing, and I think this is what made Mike wonder how Butte was doing. You know, Mike was from New York City. He grew up in Hell's Kitchen. His mom died when he was young, and his dad got hurt. So he sent Mike out to Great Falls to an aunt and uncle, and Mike lived with them until he could illegally join the Marines, I think it was. By illegally, he told him he was 18, he was 15. He didn't ask. But Mike lived in Great Falls, and I said to him one time, Mike, did you like Montana when you first got here? Did you always like it the way you do now? He said, I guess not. I ran away 3 times. That was Mike. The third time was to the military, and underage. But he stayed in. And he served, as you may know, in every single branch of the military. A couple of branches still underage, but he was one of a kind. And like a lot of us from Butte, he didn't want to, nor could he, forget it. I know some of you have traveled and maybe left Butte for a while. Now, not everybody comes home to Butte, back to Butte. But there are those of us who can't, nor do we want to, get it out of our minds. Simply because we've never been any other place quite like it. Both place and people and activities, events, especially when I was a kid. I wasn't born when the comet was going by. I was born in the tail of the comet. The comet went by in the 1890s, and I wasn't born until the 30s. But the comet was still there. The tail of it was still there, and I was born in that. And my folks owned restaurants uptown, so I was raised on Park Street. And it's quite a lesson. Raised on Park Street in the 30s, and the 40s, and the 50s. Oh, damn. I mean, they'd say to me, don't go in those bars now, my grandma. Don't go in those bars. There's no place for kids. But you couldn't help it because you'd walk down the street. As a little kid, which I was allowed to do, they didn't let me get too far from the restaurants. But I'd walk down the street and I'd see a guy going into whatever Walkers. They're on Park Street by the bank now, Metal Bank. See somebody, the Walkers thing is still on the sidewalk there. If you notice at the Walkers bar, yeah, it's terrific. I hope they maintain that. I think they are. When that door would open, Butte would rush out. I mean, the noise and the jingle of the coins or the chips being thrown on the tables, gambling. The light swearing. It was never, in those days, it was never bad swearing, but you could hear light swearing, some loser at one of the tables, And the smoke and the smell, it wasn't bad. But I've never smelled it again in my life, nor have I ever heard it again, the way those places were. Including Babe Maloney's, and a lot of others. I could name a lot of others, but then you'd think I took up drinking. As a Butte guy, right? Yeah. So this place and its memories stick to people. And when they go on, a lot of thought around Butte that old Butte people don't try to help Butte. Well, a hell of a lot of them do try to help Butte because they can't help it. They've got to help the hometown. Sometimes it's difficult because some of the infrastructure that companies need or whatnot isn't quite here, so they have to change their mind and put a plant elsewhere. But none of us who have lived here can go without trying to assist. I wasn't sure how to help when I first got to Congress, other than that Superfund Act, which I did help with, and we got it passed, and it was enormously helpful in its way to Butte. One of the reasons I wasn't quite sure what to do is I didn't understand the mess that had been made. Now, I'm Butte, so I can say mess. We just won't take it outside this room. A mess had been made. Those old kind of whitish yellow hills with no grass and no trees on them? They were up off of Woolman Street and up the top of Main Street and Montana Street. I thought God put those there. Honest to God, I did. And I'd play on them with my cousins and relatives, and it turned out later they were kind of toxic. I don't think it affected any of us much. Wade and Silverbow Creek, I don't think that affected us much either. But Carol used to live down by Silverbow Creek, and she was in it every day. And then found out, at the age of 9 or something, that maybe it wasn't the best kind of water to be swimming in and getting your ears and all the rest of it. So because I didn't recognize the problem, even from Butte, because I didn't fully recognize the problem, I wasn't sure what the hell to do about it. So I came home and went to people who were beginning to use this odd word, restoration. I said, tell me how to help. And they did. And we helped a great deal, I think. I like to think. Although some of those hills I didn't want to see leave, because I remember the day that my first cousin, his mother and my mother were sisters. My first cousin, Bobby, came to me one time and said, he said, I got a new bike with a motor on it. You want to ride on my bike? And I said, oh, yeah, I guess so, Bobby. And I knew from riding on his pedal bike that he was crazy. The last name Knievel. And he was crazy. He was crazy. And he and I hung out in his grandma's house and in my grandma's house. And whenever I've been around people who, we'd be trading stories, whether it's politicians or business people or whatever, and they say, pointing in my direction or the table where I am's direction, they say things like, you haven't lived until, and then they've got some until, something they did that was more exciting than anybody else would do. And usually at the end of those meetings, I say to them, before I go, I want to challenge something that was said here. The truth in America is that you haven't lived until you've ridden on the back of a teenage Evel Knievel motorcycle jumping toxic ore dumps in Butte, Montana. That's an adventure. And it was. We took some of his and my favorite jumps out. Well, I only went with him about 4 times, and then he enjoyed falling off, and I didn't like it, so I quit. Just a word about him. It's hard to say Knievel and Butte without saying something about him. No doubt Bobby was a rascal. No doubt about it. In his own way, he was a rascal. But he was a really honorable guy. As a kid and later, he was honorable. Those places he broke into uptown, they would find a stack of cash back in their freezer or somewhere. And a note from Bobby, he wouldn't sign it, it'd be on it. And that is, what do you mean I can't break into this place? Right? But he'd give him the money back. He was an honorable guy, but he had to have that thrill of breaking in somewhere and not getting caught. He was not only honorable, he was really smart. He could not have made himself famous by jumping automobiles unless he had some way to say to America and to act in a way that America would call what he does by a different name. What do they call it? Super sports or? Extreme sports. They called it extreme sports. Now there's a whole industry around the extreme sports. There were guys doing nutty stuff, like Joey Chitwood and his Auto Daredevils that Bobby and I went to see down at Clark Park. They were doing crazy stuff, but they weren't risking their lives. And Bobby was risking his life. And then when he would get all broken apart, he would somehow get up and usually without help walk to the top of the ramp and say something like, "This is my goddamn last jump." Something. He'd say something. Then he'd go to the hospital for 3 weeks and heal right up and do it again. So my son, finally about Bobby, my son Griff, who Bobby just adored, he was so good to Griff, bought him a little motorcycle when Griff was a little kid and took him on his bike a lot. wanted to take him to Vegas, but my wife was not going, wouldn't go for that. Griff said to me, you know what Knievel's thing was, Dad? He was a real live play-action doll who would die, but like the doll, you could keep playing with it because he'd get up and go again. He was a real play-action doll, a live one with blood and bones. And I think that's right, and we haven't really seen it since, at least not with the spangle that Bobby put on it. Well, he and I played on these dumps, and you haven't lived, right? I grew up at my grandma's house across from, we had two houses, and we had one house, but my grandma also had a house, and because my parents were very busy in the restaurant, I don't know if some of you might remember it, we sold it in the 60s, but it was called the American Candy Shop, and it was right in the middle of, between Dakota and Main Street, right smack in the middle on the north side of the street. And it was a very significant restaurant at one time. And Butte had 3 floors, busy all the damn time. It was a great place to grow up, but I didn't stay downtown all the time. I was at my grandma's house a lot. And she lived on Montana Street, just one door over from the original mine. You all know where that mine is, up by what used to be St. Mary's across the street. Kids cannot resist a mine yard. Whew. I don't think any of us can resist it. We look at them, we look at the gallows frames, it means something else in our lives, right? Not just it's there. And kids could not resist it. And we'd go in the original mine yard, we'd break a board on the top, and somebody let us break it on the bottom, and we'd hammer another nail into the middle of the board. You know, it'd be a big toe. And then we could swing it, you see, and we'd climb in the bottom, and we'd put it back, right? You see what I mean? Take the nails out top, bottom, and have a center nail. So we'd go through these, and occasionally Anaconda would fix them, and of course they had a lot of boards in that fence, so we'd just go find another one, and played up there, I suppose, from the time I was 8 or 9 in that mine yard until I was probably 12. Bobby would come up from Parrott Street and be with us, and there's several stories about that where this guy was risking his life in crazy ways that none of the rest of us would do. But I always escaped. I didn't want to cut corners too close. So when the guy was coming or we heard somebody yell or whistle, we had, you know, code, right, as you did when you were a kid. Then we'd go for a fence and get out, go for the swing board in the fence and get out. One day I was running for the fence and I felt this jerk on the back of my collar, and I was lifted up in the air this high. And a deep voice said, "I got you now, you little bastard." Oh, scared me so bad, I mean, seriously scared me. Took me to his little hut. You know, he was just the watchman. But he was doing the right stuff. Kids were going to get hurt up there. And he took me, he said, "I know who you are. Your folks are downtown. They're fine business people. They own the American Candy Shop, and they own another little restaurant over in Simon's," if you remember where Simon's was. Burr's became later. He said, "You own 2 restaurants, you're all fine people. And better than that, I know your grandma Lizzie Keogh, and I'm about to call her and tell her what you're doing." I'm like, oh my God. Dial the phone, didn't have to look it up, he knew the number. And "Lizzie, I got your grandson here. He's been breaking the law by coming in the original." She recognized his voice. "Oh, love of God, Tommy, is he over there?" I wondered where he was. "Come and get him, Lizzie. Come and get him at the St. Mary's side gate." So around she came all the way from the west side of the original, around the fence there. And Jesus Christ, I thought I was in the ring with Muhammad Ali. I mean, she beat me up all the way to the house. You know, get up close to me. Wham. And it scared her because her husband was killed in the mines. And killed from the mines. He had Miner's Con. Yeah, Miner's Con, which is black lung, except it's white. and from the silica. You know, at least the coal is dust, and it doesn't cut your lungs the way some of those silica pieces did. It was a bad death. I don't remember Grandpa, because I was so tiny when he died. But that's what my grandmother feared of Bobby and I and Terry Dunphy and other kids from around there, Ralphie McCauley, who's passed away now, bless him. We'd all go in there and goof around. Years later, I got elected to the Montana legislature from Silverboat County in Butte. And I absolutely just kind of migrated to trying to clean this place up. And I didn't understand people saying, even though I said it a minute ago, I didn't understand this thing about Butte. Well, Butte looks terrible. Butte's a mess. Butte's ugly. I didn't understand it. You know, you're from there. You don't think that. Although Braley wrote, she's ugly. You say old Butte is? And grimy and bleak and drear. You know, partner, I never could see it. And I've lived there for many a year. So Bernard Braley, wonderful American poet, lived here and wrote about Butte occasionally. That's how I was. But the mess was here, and it was dangerous. And we needed to clean it up. And so when I was in the legislature, I had bills to try to do that. And the company, Anaconda, was still reigning supreme. The company and my fellow legislators from Butte, with the exception of a guy named Larry Steinmetz, all said, Jesus, Pat wants to fill in the Berkeley pit on something called restoration. I didn't know how to fill in the Berkeley pit. I just thought we ought to get rid of some of these landscape problems around here. And my legislators in the company just killed that bill dead. I mean, we never had a chance. And although those legislators were really good friends of mine, and I wish to hell they were alive today so I could come over here and visit with them. They're all passed on now. They're all older than I was, and the women are all, as soon as I tell you this now, all the ladies are supposed to say no. But I'm 80. Come on. No. Yeah, I'm 80. So a lot of my friends are gone. And but nonetheless, I served with Jack Healy and Larry Steinmetz and Bobby Lee and a number of people, and an interesting thing happened. And I just tell you this as one of their friends. But when they got home, people would say to them, how come that new kid, that Pat Williams, votes for an increase in the miner's tax on ACM, who paid the lowest miner's tax in America, in Montana? How come Pat Williams votes for that and you don't? What the hell's the matter with you guys? Anaconda ought to help pay their way here. Oh, that Williams, you know, he's a big spender. They were doing that stuff to me, and they were all doing it except the guy named Larry Steinmetz. And Pat wants to fill in the Berkeley pit, and you know. And what I was trying to say to them was, look, there are jobs galore in Butte. We mined. We were still mining in those days, the late 60s. But it's going to run out. I mean, everybody knew it was going to run out. We didn't know when, but we thought, not as soon as it did, by the way, but we thought it was going to run out. And then the question was, what the hell are we going to do? Well, what we had to do was get the federal government help us create jobs to clean up the mess. Made a lot of jobs making the mess. Now the nest needs cleaning. So Butte could get both sides of it. And I tried in the legislature, but I didn't get very far. 11 years later, I was elected from the Western District, this district of Montana. Like if you took a line this side of Great Falls and drew it from Canada down to Wyoming, pretty much all the counties on the western side of that were in the old Western Congressional District. So if you were fairly well liked, just fairly well, young or old, and you were from Butte, and you knew people in Butte and Anaconda, you owned the Western District as a politician, because Butte's and Anaconda's vote was so big. And especially in a primary, a Democratic primary like I ran in, there were, I think, 13, Evan. Huh?
There was
No,
6 good ones.
Yeah, I think there were 13 people in it, though. Yeah, I do. And Evan comes around to correct me when when I'm seldom wrong, but he and so we all got in it and ran, and the top 6 won. So I was among, or maybe it was 7, but the top batch won, and the rest of them lost. I ran like 2nd or 3rd. And then after those guys got done with me, because I was over there saying, look, Anaconda's got to clean up their act, and we got to get the federal government and other people in here, including Anaconda, to help us clean up this town. People don't want to come and see a town that they hear in the news is loaded with arsenic and the rest of it. Clean it up, make money on it. God, those guys just beat the hell out of me when they came home. So the next time I ran, so the first time I ran either 2nd or 3rd out of the 7. The next time I ran 6th. I damn near didn't even make the list of people that went over there. We had 6, 7 representatives at the time. And it was because my old pals beat me up. And I knew it, but you know, that's politics. They were trying to protect themselves. And that's how you go along in politics. It was an interesting happening, though, for Butte and friends. I got to Congress, and Superfund was coming along. It had been being worked on, and so I was not there at the beginning. And Mike was barely there at the beginning, Mansfield. So it was up to some new people to, from Montana to understand how important it was. And a hell of a lot of Montanans didn't think Superfund was all that important. Some of you remember it. My friends in Missoula and some other places, they weren't so enamored with this. And in fact, a Butte person who was wildly popular here and later became mayor and was a hell of a good mayor, opposed Superfund with all his might. Because he said it will scar our city. It will give us the impression, give people the impression that we're a dirt hole, you know. No, it's going to take a few years, but they'll clean it up. So Superfund was brand new. 81 or 2 had passed. I got elected in '79, so I was brand new too. But I tried to contour it a little bit to make more sense here. Came out and talked to people and got it sorted up. As you know, restoration is a process. And it's a process of reestablishing, to the extent possible. Nature resists a lot of restoration. But to the extent possible, the structure, the financing, the environmental integrity of indigenous habitats. Land that was already here, you had to put back. So that's what we were doing. But there was another thing going on here, and I would talk about it. And then restoration people from around the country would call me or come to see me. And my thing was, look, there's more to restore. I'm from Butte, Montana. They said, oh, yeah, we know about Butte. And some guy said to me one time, yeah, God, I was there for a few days. Well, it was supposed to be a few days, but he said, I found the M&M, and I stayed through a weekend. And he said, geez, we had a hell of a time. My point to the people who restore and reclaim was, this isn't only about land. It's about the people living on and making a living from that restored land. It may be about people and their ability to exist in their homes and their hometown. So I insisted, and I tell you the truth, in the beginning there weren't a lot of members of Congress insisting, but the people that were close to this bill caught on fast, and they said, no, Williams is right about this. He comes from a place, it's apparently a tough old copper town, but it survives on truth mixed with legend. And they said those kind of towns are fragile, and you can break them if you're not careful. Just don't break it, right? There's no way to buy it if you broke it. Don't break it. And so we went through and tried to do that. I wish I could remember more of exactly how we did that and share it with you, but I didn't have time to put my papers together, and you know, at my age. Let me read a couple of things to you quickly. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent. This is about 5-6 years old. Have been spent primarily by the federal government to clean a significant but relatively small portion of these despoiled lands and waterways throughout America. The expenditures, employment, training programs, profit, and restoration economy is what it ought to be called. And I heard that word, restoration economy, and I said, yeah, that's it. If we had a mining economy, let's have a restoration economy. It's not going to be as big as mining. It's not going to be as flashy as mining. It put a hell of a lot of people to work. When this was written, it says, the West had yet to emphasize and recognize that a clean environment and a healthy economy are, or certainly could be, in step one with the other. And although there are hiccups as you try to do restoration and keep the economy good, I think generally that statement is correct. I'm going to read a couple of other short things as well. I worked in a place, and I still go down there once in a while for nothing and help out, but I worked in a place called the Center for the Rocky Mountain West. It's a place that worries about landscape in the West and its people and does studies and tries to make things happen on the ground. I worked there, and we conducted economic research which identified 251 in America, largely rural counties lying within 30 miles of public forest lands. Okay? Only 43 of those 250 plus counties were found to be heavily dependent on the industry, even in the late 1970s. Think about that. The industry was at its high point, and the towns closest to the trees didn't have a good economy. Between then, 70, and 1991, earnings from those employed in wood products in those counties collapsed, falling from over $3 billion to $1.8 billion earnings. Earnings fell by another $235 million, almost wiping it out, from 91 to 98. In the process, the timber industry's share of all labor earnings in those counties fell from 22% to less than 9%. Although harvest levels have remained somewhat stable in a number of places, they've declined in others. And what has declined is the number of workers and salaries paid to those workers. You know why? They brought in machines. They did what we did in the pit here. They brought in these enormous machines. The pit gobbled up land. In fact, my wife's brother, Bobby Griffith, passed away too young. Hard work. It was one of the, I think, 3-4 shovel operators in the pit. And he said I used to say he didn't like his job. He'd say, every time I take out 2 scoops, I'm putting 100 miners out of work, Pat. And it was true. So it wasn't that mining wasn't going good or timber wasn't going good. It was that mining had the big equipment and timber had what they call a fellow buncher, which walks through you've seen them, grabs a tree, snips it off, tips it over, an arm comes out and delimbs it, and they set it in a truck and go on. There's a guy in a truck running the damn thing. So when mining and timber left, and I paid a lot of attention to it because I wanted to know what in the hell and who was to blame. But when it kind of left western Montana, it turns out that environmentalists were not at fault. Were they some things they did that denied contracts to timber companies that maybe would have been all right? Yeah, a few things. Now and then, a few things. Or held up in court some of these logging operations that could have gone on. But that was less than 4%. It was 4% of timber's problem. Their problem was overseas. Now this. With regard to rehabilitation and restoration, there is work to be done, mountains of it. The Forest Service oversees 373,000 miles of roads, official Forest Service roads. 373. My goodness. Some of these roads are used by logging and recreational vehicles and should be maintained and repaired, and its jobs. Thousands of miles of other forest roads are no longer useful, but their jobs too. They ought to be reclaimed because they're creating all this runoff. I mean, you don't have to be a screaming environmentalist to get that. Hell, 3/4 of you here hunt, you know what's going on. The scars of the old clear cuts and the resulting sediment runoff are despoiling our vital, life-giving headwaters, spawning grounds, and calving grounds. Montanans hunting fish. People come in here by the hundreds of thousands now to do the same. We wrecked that. It's good night, Irene. One more thing here on this. Would it be costly? Well, of course. In fact, too costly. It's just that I don't think it's as costly as ignoring it, both to people's health and to the resulting mess if we don't get after it. You know, it's like those old defense ammo dumps where they left them now. Jesus, now they're afraid to touch them. They'll go off and blow up the city. All this, you know, this isn't going to blow up, but it does have dangers in it if we don't get after it. Only a few years ago, here's what happened in Idaho. In central Idaho, taxpayers ponied up $10 million repairing roads damaged by landslide, and the Forest Service estimates that past logging, maybe even a century ago, and 20 years earlier, was responsible for 80% of those landslides. With $10 million for healthy forests, here's what Idaho did. They restored 60 miles of roads. Now there are hundreds, but they restored 60, so it's expensive. With that same money, they put up 20 miles of the barriers that were eliminating trout, right, from getting to where they wanted to be, where we could catch them. They planted 3,000 acres of trees for that 10 million. And on 1,000 acres of undergrowth, they removed it and weed control in an environmentally sensitive manner. So there was work being done, and then after I missed Montana and I missed Butte, I left Congress. That is the reason I left. I mean, not bullshit, that's why. You get, it's easy. You go away for a while, you miss your friends and your family and the place and hunting, fishing, whatever you do, playing bad golf, whatever the hell it is. And I missed the hell out of it. So I said to Carol, who had missed it, I think every day for the last 3, 4, 5 years we were there, and told me how much she was missing it. All of that was weighing on me. And I thought, well, I've had 9 terms here. That's more consecutive terms than anybody'd ever had. Some of them, like Mike, moved from the House a few terms to the Senate, then put enough years in the Senate that he had more terms than I did. But they weren't consecutive in one body. And the body it's difficult to stay in, by the way, is the House. Senators are like Supreme Court judges. Jesus, they're there for life. And not true in the House. It turns over. So you guys were really good to me, and I was really fortunate. So I came home and decided we're not getting enough done on this restoration thing. We had a new governor at the time named Brian Schweitzer. And Brian Schweitzer was the kind of a guy that if you could catch up with him, and that was a major task, but if you could catch up with him, he'd sit and listen to you. And if he liked what he heard, he'd invite you back and say, let's see if there's a way to do this. So I talked to him about the grandiose restoration economy, but it took a hell of a lot of money. He said, we'll get it from the feds. He said, I'll put a little in my budget for it, and this was after months, and we'll get it from the feds. And then he said, we got to explain it to people, Pat. So I'm going to conclude here with another 10 minutes of 5 minutes of, we stop at 5, right? We stop at 5? Okay, I'll go quickly with another 5 minutes of what we did after I came home, and I had some piece in this. We formed a Western Montana Restoration Summit and held it in Missoula. And we had a number of panels, a number of Lolo forest supervisors, national forest supervisors, roundtable discussions with timber guys and environmentalists who, it's really interesting. If you get them at the same table, they have more in common than we all think. And although they have a lot they don't have in common too, but it's pretty good. So we did that in '04. We did another one, roundtable 2-day thing at the Sheraton Hotel in Billings. And after we did the first one in Missoula, people and companies that were involved in restoration got to thinking, Jesus, this is a big goddamn deal. This is being recognized as an economy, which they all thought it was in the beginning. That's why they got in the business. That's why Dennis Washington got in the business. He thought it would be an economy in Montana. Hasn't quite turned out that way, but nonetheless, millions have been spent. So we started having these meetings, and in '05, we did another revitalization and restoration institute to see what kind of an institute might be formed by having panel discussions. And we didn't come up with the institute because an institute costs a lot of money, and in Montana there isn't a lot of money. And the feds usually won't fund that sort of thing, but they will fund picks and shovels and studies to a degree. Then the governor, Brian, who came to a couple of those panel discussions, said to himself and to me and to Hal Harper, this is a good idea. I don't know if we can get it going because we don't have enough money, but it's a hell of a good idea. And so he established the Governor's Watershed Restoration Project. That worked pretty good, so he established national forest restoration projects in Montana, and it was a way to see what the environmental concerns were in doing this restoration. You know, if you only take big equipment, you can make the place look better, but you screw up the groundwater, and you know, you're not sure where the old tributaries went, they're buried, and so you have to do this in a reasonable manner. And you don't need to be a pinko lefty environmentalist to want to do this. It's just kind of good sense, and in my opinion. And then in '06, the governor put out an executive order and said, all right, now therefore I, Brian Schweitzer, governor of the state of Montana, by virtue of the authority vested in me, blah, 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 do create the Montana Natural Resource Council. And he created one. Now, about this time in '06 or '07, I got busy with other things that I was doing, teaching, and later trying to create a group that Evan remembers, and some others, and with Ross's kid. And so I'm not sure, to be truthful with you, I know some of what came out of this, but I don't know where these groups went or what really happened because I was no longer in it. Let me leave you with this. Written by two wonderful authors, Dan Baum, who some of you know of, and Margaret Knox. They wrote this: Butte, Montana is the place where the Wild West married the Industrial Revolution. During the last quarter of the 19th century, our ragged mining camp here on the western slope of the Continental Divide was transformed into America's copper capital, a feverish cauldron of howling machines and new money dominating a sweep of range land the size of France. By the turn of the century, Butte was on its way to becoming the biggest city between Minneapolis and Spokane. It was jammed chock-a-block with theaters, opera houses, and so many immigrant neighborhoods: Serbia, Austria, Croatian, Finnish, Chinese, Italian, Irish, and more. It resembled an eastern seaport. The bars and the brothels. I always manage to make that out. I've got to find out what that word brothel means. It sounds good. The bar, what? Who laughed? The bars, you can laugh with me about this. The bars and the brothels were busy night and day, boys, no kidding. I was learning quick. You know, I was a kid on the street up in Park Street. Gunfights were commonplace, not when I was a kid. And the smelters bleached an opaque, arsenic-laden smog that denuded the surrounding hillsides of all their greenery. Butte is saturated with a toxic legacy. This is a little old now, this piece. It's just well written. Slag heaps and waste rock piles the size of small mesas tower everywhere. Swamps of bleached white mine tailings and layers of poisonous flue dust blanket old smelter sites, vacant lots and backyards. Butte owns the dubious distinction of anchoring what is geographically one of the federal government's most ambitious Superfund programs. From here, Superfund sites follow a trail of mining residue for 100 miles down the Clark Fork River, the easternmost tributary of the mighty Columbia and the main drainage of most of western Montana. No matter how you look at it, this is a multi-billion-dollar mess. You believed in government. You thought it could make a difference. This is one of the biggest differences it's made in a century. And you supported it, most of you, almost all of you. You were glad to have the jobs. You were glad to know we were getting attention. You were glad to clean it up. If you'd have griped and moaned, right, the mayor and everybody else said, hey, they did it over in Wallace, Idaho. People got so angry about it, EPA said, to hell with it. And the local people said, we can't support this. It's not what we want. So they're stuck with what they got. And Butte's moved on. Not as fast as we wanted. We don't see the end of the rainbow for damn sure. But it wasn't for people like you that had the guts to think it might work and tell your friends it might work, we wouldn't be where we are. Thanks for inviting me over today. Yeah. Thank you.